Flames roared through the wooden cabin as smoke curled into the sky. Through the shattered window, little Emily saw the unthinkable. Her father, Jack, a war veteran, and a police officer bound and helpless, fire closing in around them. Beside her, Rex, the loyal German shepherd, barked furiously, pulling her toward the blaze. In that moment, a 5-year-old child and her dog faced a choice that would test the strength of love, courage, and sacrifice. Before we continue, tell me where in the world you are watching from. How does this story make you feel so far? If it touches your heart, stay with us. Share your thoughts in the comments, and may your day be filled with hope and kindness. The late afternoon sun lingered low over Millstone, a small town pressed against the edge of endless woods where autumn had set every branch ablaze with shades of gold and rust. The air smelled of damp leaves, and a faint wind carried the scent of distant chimneys. It was on such a day that Jack Turner, a man hardened by years of military service, stood beside Deputy Cole Harrington at the mouth of an overgrown trail, their eyes fixed on the outline of an old log cabin said to be abandoned long ago. Jack had been asked to come along, his steady hands and sharp instincts a comfort to Cole, who had grown increasingly uneasy over rumors of strangers moving through the forest. Jack was a tall man in his early 40s, his build strong though wearied by time, with hair darkened at the roots and streaked with silver near his temples. His clothes were plain, an olive field jacket, faded jeans, heavy boots, but he carried himself with the silent confidence of someone who had faced fire before and survived. At his side, Cole Harrington, younger by a few years but marked by the same weight of responsibility, adjusted his navy jacket, the sheriff's badge pinned against his chest glinting in the fading light. His face, square and stern, betrayed little, but his restless hands betrayed nerves. He had heard too many reports of a moss-colored truck slipping into the trees at night, of shadows where none should be, and he needed proof. Just a few yards away, near the forest's edge where the trees thinned, little Emily Turner sat cross-legged on the ground with Rex, their German shepherd, leaning against her small frame. Emily, only 5 years old, was a delicate figure with golden hair that fell in messy strands around her round cheeks, her simple beige dress dusted with autumn leaves. She clutched Rex's collar as her father knelt down, his hand tightening the strap of her boots, his voice low but firm. "Stay here, sweetheart. Don't wander. I'll be back before you know it." Emily nodded, though her gray eyes shimmered with reluctance, and Rex, 6 years old with a sable coat shining under the copper light, let out a soft whine, sensing the gravity that even a child could not name. Rex was no ordinary pet. He was broad-shouldered, muscular, his black saddle markings sharp against the tan of his chest and legs. His ears stood high, his amber gaze unblinking as he watched Jack disappear into the trees. Loyal to the core, yet gentle with Emily, he had grown up as both guardian and playmate, his presence a constant anchor to the girl whose world was often quiet and lonely. Emily's small hand buried into his thick fur as she whispered, almost as if to reassure herself, "He'll come back soon." Rex's tail flicked once, but his gaze remained fixed on the trail where Jack and Cole had vanished. Inside the cabin, silence greeted the two men as they pushed open the sagging door. Dust hung in the shafts of dying light, motes drifting lazily in the air as if untouched for years. Jack scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in the broken furniture, the warped boards, the faint smell of oil that clung unnaturally in the corners. Cole stepped forward cautiously, his boots creaking on the old floorboards, his hand hovering near his holster though no sound suggested life. "Strange," he muttered. "The report said people were here." Jack said nothing, but the set of his jaw tightened. He had learned long ago that silence was often the loudest warning. It happened without warning. From the shadows beyond the collapsed hearth, figures surged forward, 3, maybe 4, their faces hidden beneath black cloth, their movements sharp and practiced. Jack barely had time to reach for Cole before a blow struck the back of his head, sending his vision spinning. Cole fought, but strong arms pulled him down, a rough voice snarling, and within moments both men were overwhelmed. Ropes bit into their wrists and ankles, duct tape sealed their mouths, and blindfolds cast them into suffocating darkness. The smell of gasoline soon followed, pungent and heavy, poured across the floor with a cruel deliberation. A match flared, and flames began to lick the dry wood, orange light swelling with a hungry hiss. Back near the forest's edge, Rex suddenly stiffened. His ears pricked, his muscles coiled, and a deep growl rumbled in his chest. Emily looked up, startled, and followed his gaze. A dark column of smoke was rising beyond the tree line, curling skyward in ominous spirals. "Daddy?" she whispered, panic flooding her small face. Rex barked sharply, tugging at her sleeve, pulling her toward the path. Emily stumbled to her feet, clutching her basket, but the fear in her chest burned hotter than her hesitation. With each bark, Rex urged her forward, and together they ran, her small shoes crunching against fallen leaves as the smell of smoke grew thicker. The forest closed around them as they pushed deeper, the air heavy with ash, the crackle of flames now audible through the trees. Emily coughed, tears blurring her sight, but Rex forged ahead, his nose low, his body tense. At last they broke into a clearing where the cabin stood, no longer a silent relic, but a pyre. Fire surged along its walls, windows spitting out sparks, and from within came the muffled shapes of men bound and struggling. Emily froze, her tiny body trembling as she caught sight of two silhouettes inside the inferno, her father and another man, their arms wrenched behind their backs, their uniforms stained and their faces bruised. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to collapse around her. The roar of flames swallowed the forest, the heat pressed against her skin, and Emily's voice cracked as she screamed, "Daddy!" Her cry cut through the chaos, piercing Jack's fading consciousness. Blindfolded and weak, he stirred against the ropes, heart pounding at the sound of his daughter's voice. Cole groaned beside him, both men jerking helplessly against their bonds as smoke clawed at their lungs. Emily sobbed, her hands clutched against her chest, while Rex barked furiously, pacing near the burning doorway, his body taut, teeth bared at the danger. The smoke thickened quickly, curling low across the clearing, forcing Emily to stumble backward as the heat swelled. She wiped her face with sooty hands, but her eyes never left the broken window where her father's shadow writhed. Her world shrank to the sight of him trapped behind flame and timber, and her heart pounded with a helpless rhythm. Rex lunged forward, snarling at the flames as though he could fight them, and Emily clung to his fur, her voice breaking with desperation. The cabin groaned as beams split and fell, sparks showering the ground, the fire's breath closing tighter around the two men inside. Emily's small voice carried through the smoke again, louder now, hoarse with fear. She called for her father, for anyone, though the forest offered only the crackle of fire in reply. Jack, his strength fading, heard her cries echo through the haze of pain, and in that moment a surge of will forced him against the ropes, his chest burning, his mind fixed only on the fragile sound of his daughter's voice. Cole, barely conscious, stirred beside him, his jaw clenched beneath the duct tape as if he too drew strength from that cry. And outside, Emily's sobs mingled with the furious growls of Rex, who braced himself against the rising blaze as though determined to guard both master and child until the last breath. The night had not yet fallen, but the clearing lay swallowed in a shroud of smoke and flame, the future suspended on a fragile thread. Emily's cries, Rex's defiance, Jack's faint struggle, all converged in that single terrible moment when hope and despair collided. The fire spread faster, the air grew hotter, and Emily could only press her small hands against her lips, praying for a miracle as the wooden cabin blazed brighter against the darkening sky. The cabin was a roaring furnace now, its timbers shrieking under the weight of fire, smoke pouring through every crack and broken window, and the forest clearing was swallowed in a haze that burned the eyes and seared the lungs. Inside, Jack Turner stirred from his stupor, his mind clawing its way back to the surface as the muffled sound of a child's cry cut through the choking dark. His head throbbed, his wrists ached where the ropes dug into his flesh, but the one thing he knew, with a certainty sharper than the flames around him, was that Emily was near, and she was calling for him. His heart pounded against his ribs, forcing strength into limbs that had nearly given up. He tried to shout, but the duct tape sealed his mouth tight, so he twisted against the bonds, groaning through clenched teeth, straining until the veins rose against his temples. Beside him, Cole Harrington lay half-conscious, his broad shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths, his face streaked with soot and blood. The heat was unbearable, each second a reminder that their time was running short, yet hope flared the moment Jack realized his daughter's voice was not a dream. Jack's eyes darted toward the sidewall where he remembered an old storage door, warped but still intact, a smaller entrance once used to haul firewood inside. With a desperate thud of his boot against the floor, he inched himself closer, his bound hands scraping against the rough boards. Through the wall's crack, he caught the faint outline of Emily's small figure outside, her hair glowing gold against the smoke, Rex straining furiously at her side. Jack forced his voice through the tape, a guttural sound that broke into fragments, but his meaning was clear enough as he banged his shoulder against the wall. Open the latch, let Rex in. Emily's tears streaked down her cheeks, her little chest heaving as she grasped what her father was asking. The latch was rusty, her hands trembling as she struggled with it, coughing as the smoke pushed outward the moment the gap widened. Rex let out a guttural bark, his body surging forward like a coiled spring released, his powerful frame disappearing into the choking dark before Emily could even gasp. She staggered back, her eyes wide, her lips whispering his name, but she did not follow. Her father had told her to stay outside, and though her heart screamed otherwise, she obeyed. Inside, Rex burst through the smoke, his thick coat already singed at the tips, his amber eyes sharp with purpose. Jack lifted his bound wrists, thrusting them toward the dog, and Rex lunged, teeth working furiously at the coarse rope, growls vibrating deep in his chest as if cursing the fire itself. The fibers began to fray, each snap a heartbeat closer to freedom, while the flames crept along the walls, beams groaning as they threatened to collapse. Jack's lungs screamed for air, his throat raw, but he held steady, trusting the animal that had been more than a guardian. He had been family. The rope gave way at last, and Jack tore the duct tape from his mouth with a ragged gasp, coughing violently, his chest convulsing as he dragged in the poisonous air. His first move was toward Cole, who was slipping deeper into unconsciousness, his face pallid beneath the soot. Jack wrapped his newly freed arms around the deputy, dragging him up despite the fire gnawing at his own strength. Rex circled them, barking wildly, his body pressed low to the ground as though guiding their every step toward salvation. The flames surged louder, and Jack staggered forward with Cole's weight slung against him, each step a battle. He could see the light of the opening Emily had created, her shadow trembling just beyond, her small voice shouting encouragement he barely heard above the roar. They reached the threshold just as a thunderous crack split the ceiling, and a burning beam dropped behind them, showering sparks that caught against Jack's jacket, singeing the fabric as Rex snapped at the falling debris to clear the way. With one last heave, Jack pushed through the doorway, Emily rushing forward to grab his arm with her tiny hands as if she could pull him herself. He stumbled into the open air, dragging Cole with him, Rex leaping through a heartbeat later, his fur smoking, his chest heaving, but his eyes burning with triumph. The moment they crossed the threshold, another beam crashed down, blocking the exit, and then, as though the cabin itself had taken its final breath, the entire structure exploded outward in a roar that shook the ground, a wave of heat and ash slamming across the clearing. They collapsed together on the frozen earth, the grass brittle beneath them, the sky above a blur of gray smoke and angry flame. Jack rolled onto his back, gasping, his arms wrapping around Emily, who clung to him, sobbing into his chest, her tears mixing with soot. Cole lay nearby, groaning faintly but alive, his body sprawled across the dirt, his badge tarnished but still pinned to his chest. Rex dropped beside Emily, his body trembling, his breath ragged, yet he pushed his muzzle into her lap, and she hugged him with all the strength her small arms could muster. For a long moment, none of them spoke, the only sound the crackling inferno consuming what remained of the cabin, the wind carrying the acrid smoke through the trees. Jack pressed his forehead to his daughter's hair, his eyes stinging with more than smoke, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You saved me. You saved us all." Emily hiccuped through her tears, her little hands gripping Rex tighter, and though she could not find words, her father's voice had already etched itself into her heart. The forest clearing still smoldered with heat, the once proud cabin reduced to a pile of collapsing embers, glowing red like a wound against the darkening sky. Jack Turner struggled to steady his breathing, his arms still wrapped around Emily, her sobs quiet now, but her body trembling against his chest. Nearby, Deputy Cole Harrington lay sprawled on the cold ground, his chest heaving shallowly, every breath ragged, each cough scraping like broken glass. The fire had spared their lives, but the smoke still clung inside their lungs, and its mark was written in the gray haze of their eyes. Jack forced himself to move, his muscles aching from strain, his head pounding from the blow he had suffered earlier. He pushed Emily gently to his side, whispering for her to stay with Rex, and crawled to Cole's side, his soldier's instinct overriding the chaos still roaring in his ears. With practiced hands, though trembling, he checked Cole's pulse, felt the rapid flutter, the shallow breaths, and he tilted the deputy's head to open his airway, pressing his palm against his chest to coax the lungs into rhythm. "Breathe with me," Jack rasped, though his own voice was broken, his words more prayer than command. Cole's face was streaked with soot, his lips tinged blue from lack of air, his broad frame shuddering as he fought to keep hold of consciousness. Jack loosened the man's collar, tore the tape remnants from his face, and forced him onto his side so the smoke could ease its grip. Each cough that racked Cole's body was a small victory, a reminder that he was still alive, though hanging by threads. Emily, wide-eyed, clutched Rex's fur, watching her father lean over the man as the world burned quietly behind them. Rex, restless and alert despite the singe of his coat, began pacing the clearing, nose to the ground, growls low in his throat. The German shepherd's body moved with intent, his ears pricking at scents invisible to the human eye, and suddenly he barked sharply, tail rigid, pulling away from Emily's grasp. Jack lifted his head at the sound, his eyes narrowing as he pushed himself up from Cole's side. He followed the dog's lead, his boots sinking into the damp earth until he saw them, the marks stamped into the soil, deep and purposeful, pointing away from the cabin. There were heavy boot prints, larger than Jack's own, pressed deep as though the men had carried weight. Alongside them were tire tracks, cut into the mud with a distinctive tread that suggested a truck had lingered there, wheels grinding as it pulled away. And then, caught in the tangled brush, Jack saw a piece of fabric. He stooped to lift it. It was cloth, rough beneath his calloused hands, its edge stained with blood still damp enough to glisten. His jaw tightened and his eyes shifted toward the direction of the tracks, a silent promise burning behind the exhaustion. The sound of hurried footsteps broke his focus, and from the tree line emerged Walter Briggs, a man in his mid-60s with a wiry frame bent by years of labor. His face was weathered, skin creased like old leather, his thinning gray hair tucked beneath a cap that had seen better days. His plaid shirt was hastily buttoned, suspenders hanging unevenly, and his hands clutched his cap nervously as he approached the scene. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, his voice cracking, eyes darting between the blaze and the battered men on the ground. Jack rose to his full height, his expression stern though his body trembled with fatigue. "Walter," he called, his voice rough but steady. "Did you see anyone out here last night?" The older man hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ground, his fingers tightening around the brim of his cap. I did notice something," he stammered, his words halting. "Saw a truck, green, kind of moss-colored, heading down toward these woods. Late, real late. But I thought it was none of my business." His voice faltered, and though he tried to meet Jack's gaze, his eyes fell away, shame flickering in their depths. Emily, holding Rex close now, peered at the man with confusion, her small brow furrowed. Jack's eyes hardened, but he didn't press further, sensing the weight of secrets in Walter's hesitation. Instead, he glanced back at the evidence, the prints, the tracks, the bloodied cloth, and tucked the fabric into his pocket with a soldier's grim resolve. Rex barked again, circling them as though to remind all present that danger still lingered unseen. The distant wail of sirens cut through the heavy silence, growing louder as streaks of red and blue flashed faintly between the trees. The ground trembled with the approach of fire engines and ambulances, their tires grinding against the forest path as they fought their way to the clearing. Emily's small hand found Jack's once more, gripping it tight, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with fear at the sight of her father swaying on his feet. He knelt to her, pulling her into his arms with the last strength he had, whispering that it would be all right, though the truth weighed heavier than his words. As the first responders spilled into the clearing, hauling hoses, medical kits, and shouting orders to one another, Jack surrendered to the exhaustion pressing against his bones. He sank to one knee, still holding Emily close, his head bowed, soot streaking his face like war paint. Cole was lifted onto a stretcher, oxygen mask pressed against his mouth, paramedics surrounding him with urgent precision. Through it all, Emily clung to her father, her small voice whispering his name, while Rex stood sentinel at their side, ears high, eyes burning like coals, unwilling to rest until his family was safe. Night had fallen over Millstone, the streets wrapped in a heavy stillness, broken only by the hum of vehicles parked outside the small police station. Inside, the fluorescent lights glared against the pale walls, and the scent of burnt timber still clung to Jack's jacket as he sat beside Deputy Cole Harrington. Cole's face was pale, the bruises along his jaw deepening to shades of violet, an oxygen tank hissing quietly at his side. Yet his posture was upright, his dark eyes sharp, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had pieced the truth together through smoke and blood. "It was a trap," Cole declared, his words cutting through the room where a handful of officers leaned forward to listen. "They tied us up and set fire to that cabin because they wanted silence. They didn't just want us gone, they wanted no trace left behind." His hand pressed against the sling supporting his arm, but his jaw stayed firm, the flicker of fire still reflected in his gaze. Across from him, Jack leaned forward, nodding slowly, his soldier's instincts echoing the same conclusion. Jack unfolded the blood-stained cloth he had retrieved from the clearing, laying it on the table like a grim relic. His voice was low but steady as he recounted the boot prints pressed into the mud, the deep tire tracks leading away from the forest, and the direction toward the river. "They didn't vanish into thin air," he said, his tone edged with certainty. "They were heading somewhere, moving cargo, maybe weapons. The cabin wasn't a hideout. It was a disposal ground for us." Emily sat in the corner of the room, her small hands gripping Rex's collar, her gray eyes wide as she watched the adults, the weight of fear still heavy but softened by the dog's steady presence. Rex, his coat still carrying the faint smell of singed fur, shifted uneasily, ears twitching at every sound beyond the walls. His body was taut, muscles coiled like a spring, as though he could still sense the lingering shadow of those who had fled. When an officer mentioned the old warehouse near the river, Rex's head lifted sharply, his amber eyes fixing on Jack as if confirming the suspicion himself. Jack rose, motioning for the leash, and Cole, though weakened, gave a nod of approval. The night air outside was cold, damp with mist rising off the Millstone River, the moon a pale disk veiled by drifting clouds. Rex padded ahead, nose to the ground, his breaths loud in the silence as he guided them down the muddy banks. Emily clung to Jack's hand, her other arm wrapped around Rex's leash, her small body dwarfed by the weight of everything she had witnessed. At last, Rex stopped, his ears stiff, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he pawed at the earth near a rusted fence. Beyond it loomed the dark outline of a warehouse, its corrugated walls streaked with rust, its windows boarded yet showing faint cracks of light. Jack's breath tightened in his chest as he pushed the gate open, the hinges shrieking in protest. Inside the yard, the ground was littered with fresh tire tracks, the mud still wet, shoe prints overlapping in chaotic directions. Near the entrance, he spotted a folded map, weathered with time but marked with heavy strokes of fresh ink. The circle drawn over the warehouse itself was unmistakable, the kind of signal only meant for those who knew where to come. His fingers clenched around the paper as Cole, leaning heavily on another officer, muttered, "This is it." Their staging ground, Emily pressed close to Rex, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Daddy, is it safe here?" Jack crouched to her height, brushing soot-streaked hair from her face, his eyes softened, though his voice was firm. "No, sweetheart. It isn't safe. That's why you'll stay behind when we move in." She bit her lip hard, tears threatening to fall, and buried her face against Rex's neck. The dog's tail thumped lightly, but his eyes never left the shadows beyond the warehouse, his senses alive with warning. Back at the station, preparations began in earnest. Maps were spread across tables, radios crackled with orders, and the sharp scent of gun oil filled the room as weapons were checked and loaded. Cole, though bandaged and still pale, stood among his men, his presence an anchor even as his body fought to keep up. Jack stood at his side, silent but resolute, his broad shoulders squared beneath his worn jacket. He was no longer just a bystander dragged into the fire. He had seen the face of the threat, and he would not walk away. Emily sat on a bench outside the office, her small hands clutching Rex's fur as tears slid silently down her cheeks. She understood more than her years should have allowed, and her silence weighed heavier than any outburst. When Jack emerged to kneel in front of her, his eyes glistening in the harsh light, she threw her arms around him and shook her head. "Don't go. she whispered, voice muffled against his jacket. Jack's hand pressed gently against the back of her head, his voice thick with love and sorrow. I have to, Emily. But you won't be alone. Rex will stay with you, and I will come back. Rex shifted closer, pressing his body against Emily's knees as though sealing the promise himself. His eyes met Jack's, unblinking, loyal, filled with the weight of silent understanding. The girl held onto the dog and wept quietly, her tears dampening his fur, while outside the station, the first convoy of police cars rolled into the night, their lights piercing the mist, as Millstone prepared for the reckoning waiting by the river. The first pale light of morning crept over Millstone, painting the mist that rose from the river in shades of silver and white. Along the narrow road leading to the abandoned warehouse, the silence was shattered by the low growl of engines and the flash of red and blue lights cutting through the fog. Police vehicles rolled into position, their tires grinding into wet gravel, while armed officers poured out, their boots striking the ground with practiced rhythm. The night of planning had led to this moment, and every breath seemed to hang heavy with anticipation. Jack Turner adjusted the strap of his jacket, his broad frame tense as he stood beside Deputy Cole Harrington, whose arm was still bound in a sling, but whose eyes burned with determination. Cole's face carried the marks of smoke and battle, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his expression one of grim resolve. Jack's silence spoke louder than any words, his soldier's instincts alive again as he scanned the warehouse that loomed ahead, its rusted walls and boarded windows standing like a fortress against the river's edge. The air smelled of oil and damp wood, and beneath it all lingered the metallic tang of danger. Inside the warehouse, shadowy figures moved between stacked crates, their low voices rumbling with impatience, unaware of the noose tightening around them. Dylan Cross, the man whose name had long been whispered in fear, towered over the others, his heavy frame wrapped in a dark coat, his thick beard shadowing a face marked by arrogance and scars of old fights. His eyes were cold, almost black, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command, hardened by years of smuggling and bloodshed. Around him, men checked weapons, their movements sharp, the metallic click of rifles echoing in the cavernous space. The signal came with a sharp shout. Cole's voice carried through the radio. "Move in!" In an instant, the clearing erupted with noise. Sirens flared, officers charged from every side, and the first bursts of gunfire cracked through the morning air. Bullets sparked against metal walls, splinters flew from shattered crates, and chaos tore the warehouse apart. Jack moved with purpose, his eyes locked on Cole as they pushed forward, taking cover behind barrels and crates, every muscle alive with the urgency of survival. Rex, released from his leash, bounded through the melee, his bark fierce, his body weaving with uncanny precision. The firefight raged with brutal intensity. Smugglers fired wildly, their defiance loud but uncoordinated, while trained officers advanced with steady resolve. Dylan Cross remained at the center, his pistol raised with steady hands, his voice barking orders as though the storm around him was nothing more than noise. He turned his gaze on Cole, recognition flashing with venom, and with cold precision he raised his gun to fire. Cole, exposed in the open for a heartbeat, froze as the barrel aligned with his chest. Jack reacted without hesitation, his body surging forward, slamming into Cole to shove him aside just as the shot cracked through the air. The bullet tore into wood, splintering at inches from where Cole had stood. Dylan cursed, his teeth bared, and before he could steady for another shot, Rex lunged with explosive power, his jaws clamping down on Dylan's forearm. The pistol clattered to the floor as the man roared in pain, his massive body twisting against the animal that would not let go. Rex growled, his teeth buried deep, his amber eyes blazing with feral loyalty. Officers swarmed in, seizing the moment as Dylan staggered, his strength no match for the force that had struck him from both man and beast. Hands grabbed his shoulders, forced him to the ground, shackles biting into his wrists as his curses filled the air. Around them, the last of his men were subdued, their weapons clattering across the concrete floor as they were dragged into submission. The warehouse echoed now, not with defiance, but with the final cries of defeat, the storm breaking at last into silence. Jack pulled Rex back, prying his jaws free with firm hands, his chest heaving as relief flooded him. The aftermath unfolded swiftly. Evidence was gathered, crates filled with stolen goods and weapons, maps linking routes across the state, and papers bearing Dylan's signature. The smugglers were loaded into waiting vans, their heads bowed, their futures sealed. Dylan himself, blood seeping from his arm where Rex had struck, was shoved into the back of a police truck, his dark eyes burning with hatred even as the heavy door slammed shut. Justice, long delayed, had finally caught him. Days later, the courthouse in Millstone was filled with the murmur of townsfolk who had come to witness the trial. Dylan Cross, stripped of arrogance but still smoldering with defiance, sat at the defendant's table, his heavy frame dwarfed by the gravity of the law. Witnesses spoke, evidence was presented, and the jury's decision was swift: guilty on all counts. For arson, attempted murder, and smuggling, he was sentenced to decades behind bars, his empire crumbling to dust. The townspeople left the courthouse with relief, the shadow that had lingered over their lives finally lifted. When winter settled fully over Millstone, the town square came alive with lanterns and banners, a celebration of courage and survival. The mayor, a short woman with silver hair and a voice that carried to every corner of the crowd, stood on the stage with a smile that belied the hardship of the weeks before. Jack stood off to the side, his olive jacket pressed but still scarred by smoke, his expression humble, his eyes glistening with quiet pride. Emily, her golden hair tied back with a ribbon, stood beside Rex, her small hands nervously twisting at her dress as the mayor's words rang out. "And so tonight," the mayor declared, her voice firm with emotion, "we honor the smallest hands and the fiercest hearts that turned the tide of darkness. Emily, Turner, and Rex, for your bravery and loyalty, this town owes you more than words." She bent to place a medal around Emily's neck, the polished silver glinting in the lantern light, and another medal was fastened proudly to Rex's collar, the dog barking once as the crowd erupted in applause. Emily clutched her medal to her chest, her eyes shimmering with tears, while Rex's tail thumped against the wooden stage. The crowd cheered, lanterns swayed in the crisp night air, and Jack wiped discreetly at his eyes, his chest swelling with a pride too vast for words. He had faced fire, smoke, and death, but it was the sight of his daughter and the loyal dog beside her that moved him most. In the glow of celebration, as neighbors clasped hands and laughter spread through the square, Jack understood that courage was not measured by battles fought alone, but by the love that gave ordinary souls the strength to do the impossible. In the end, this story is not only about a father, a child, and a loyal dog. It is about the quiet strength of those who act with compassion, who sacrifice without asking for recognition, and who remind us that true heroism often comes from the most unexpected places. These silent heroes walk among us every day, and their kindness has the power to change the world. Take a moment to share this story with someone you care about, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to stay with us for more stories of courage and love. May God bless you and your family with peace, hope, and protection, just as He blessed those who stood together in this tale.